What's going on, guys? Hey, we continue this week with reestablishing truth. And one thing I wanted to do was just take a brief moment to remind everybody of what our series is for. This series, Reestablishing Truth, is a weekly devotional that I've been creating just about every single week, responding to some of the major belief system in our world today. And every belief system has a worldview, and every worldview, by the way, is created with a few essential, or you could even call them existential questions. In other words, a worldview is formulated by the following. Does God exist or does he not exist? What do I believe about creation? Was it created, or do I believe everything on the earth and the universe was accidental? What do I believe about people? What do I believe about morality? What do I believe about purpose? What do I believe about history? And what do I ultimately believe about human destiny after we all die? Those 7 questions are questions that ultimately formulate everybody's worldview, regardless of whether you know that you have a worldview or not. So one thing we've been working on in these devotionals is the sense of truth and what truth is not, and also utilizing reason. We've been addressing a number of things, even from the moral base of things as it pertains to human identity and what it means to be human and what's wrong when we reject truth and what that does to our humanity. But today, I want to take more of a route back to the second question when one is determining their worldview. The second question is, what do I do essentially with creation? Do I believe that this world and this universe was created, or do I believe that it was accidental? And I have an article here by Dr. Frank Turek. He's an apologist from crossexamine.org. And he has this article that he wrote titled, Why Trust Reason If You Are an Atheist? Why Trust Reason If You Are an Atheist? And you can find this article on crossexamine.org. I'm just going to read the article and basically summarize and provide commentary where I can here. But he starts and he says, and he's mainly writing to atheists, if you read the threads of several of the blog entries on this site, you will see both atheists and Christians charging one another with committing quote-unquote logical fallacies. So, you watch all these internet debates. This person says, that's a logical fallacy. Another person says, no, you have a logical fallacy. The assumption that both sides are making is that there is this objective realm of reason out there. An objective realm of reason that, number 1, we all have access to. Number 2, that it tells the truth about the real world. And number 3, that something we ought to use correctly if we want to know the truth. There is something that we ought to use correctly if we want to know the truth. In other words, whenever you start arguing for logical fallacies and things of that nature, you are claiming that objective truth exists. Something that an atheist can't necessarily do. Maybe you already see the irony in the claim. Frank Turek says, my question for the atheists is, how do you justify these assumptions if you don't believe that God exists? If atheistic materialism is true, it seems to me that reason itself is impossible. For if mental processes, according to the atheist, are nothing but chemical reactions in the brain, then there is no reason to believe that anything is true, including your atheistic theory of materialism. Chemicals cannot evaluate whether or not a theory is true. You can't take a Sprite can and shake it up and then say, all right, chemicals in the Sprite can reason for me. You can't do that. Chemicals can't evaluate whether or not a theory is true. Chemicals don't reason, but chemicals react. So Turek goes on and he says, this is ironic because atheists, who often claim to be champions of truth and champions of reason, have made truth and reason impossible by their theory of materialism. So even when atheists are right about something, their worldview gives us no reason to believe them because reason itself is impossible in a world supposedly governed only by chemical and physical forces. In other words, do you see the contradiction in the atheistic argument? The atheistic argument is that God doesn't exist, and I'm using reason and logic in order to combat the thought that God exists. Well, If all that exists is physical, material stuff, and there's no such thing as anything that's spiritual or anything that's intellectual, then your entire argument is shot. Turret goes on and he says, not only is reason impossible in an atheistic world, but the typical atheist assertion that we should rely on reason alone cannot be justified. Why not? Because reason actually requires faith. Turret goes on for an explanation of how reason requires faith. As J. Budzewski points out in his book called What We Can't Know, he says the motto, reason alone, is nonsense in the first place. Reason itself must presuppose faith. Why? Because a defense of reason by reason itself is circular and therefore worthless. In other words, you can't say that reason exists because reason exists. He says our only guarantee that human reason works is God who made it, or rather God who is the origin of it. Let's unpack Budzewski's point by considering the source of reason. And this would be our position. This would be our defense, not as atheistic materialists, but as believers who place our faith in an ultimate person, an ultimate mind. He says our ability to reason can come from one of only two sources. Either our ability to reason arose from pre-existing intelligence, or it did not, in which case it arose from supposedly mindless matter. That'd be the atheistic position. So either pre-existing intelligence existed beforehand, or it did not. Those are the only two options. The atheists and the Darwinists and the materialists believe by faith that our minds arose from mindless matter without intelligent intervention. I say quote unquote by faith because it contradicts all scientific observation, which demonstrates that an effect cannot be greater than its cause. You can't give what you haven't got. Yet atheists believe that dead, unintelligent matter has produced itself into intelligent life. It doesn't make any sense. This is like believing, here's a great illustration. This is like believing that the Library of Congress and all of its information resulted from an explosion in a printing shop. That just wouldn't make any sense whatsoever. Turret goes on and he starts to conclude and he says, I think it makes much more sense to believe that the human mind is made in the image of the great mind, God himself. In other words, our minds can apprehend truth and can reason about reality because they were built by the architect of truth, reality, and reason itself. That's God. And he concludes now, he says, so I have two questions for the atheist. Number one, what is the source of this immaterial reality known as reason that we are all presupposing, utilizing in our discussions, and accusing one another of violating on occasion? Did that just come from some chemical reaction? That doesn't make any sense. And number two, if there is no God and we are nothing but chemicals, why should we trust anything we think, including the thought that there is no God? So you can't trust a chemical reaction. That doesn't make any sense. No, see, your mind is actually utilizing logic and reason and rationality because there is an ultimate mind in which those things originate from. Does the Bible back up this argument or this point that Frank Turek is making? I think so. John chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, or you could say the Logos, and the Word, or the Logos, was with God, and the Word, or the Logos, was God. And that word for Logos means logic or mind. In the beginning was the logic, and the logic was with God, and the logic was God. It's speaking about Jesus himself. The ultimate mind of God, the Trinity, the Godhead, is what allows you and I today to utilize logic and reasoning in our everyday life. An atheist who believes that he is just merely a walking and talking chemical accident cannot claim any sort of rationality because chemicals don't think. Minds have the ability to think. People have the ability to think because a pre-existent intelligence has existed before us and been given to us. So maybe this is a very deep devotional for you today. If you want to read more, again, you can go to crossexamine.org. Why trust reason if you're an atheist, if you want to read the article a little more slowly. God bless. Take care. This is Reestablishing the Truth.